Hello, everybody, and good evening. We're going to get started in just a minute. Before we do, we found a set of keys at the check-in table. If you have the Panda Bear keychain, please come see me before we get started. Thanks.
Good evening, everyone. We are going to get started with the program. And first, I'm Kevin Woodhouse, City Manager of Pacifica, and thank you for being here tonight. This is a great turnout. Very pleased with this turnout for what is an incredibly vital topic for Pacifica now and into the future for decades. So thank you for being here and participating. I get the privilege of making a few housekeeping comments, the really important stuff, like bathrooms. You can go down this hall for a bathroom, or you can go out the door and down through there, or I think maybe just right through there to get to the bathrooms. And there will be a survey form at your table that you will be given and can fill out later. And you see where the exits are, emergency exits, always important to announce. But more importantly, dinner. If you haven't eaten, please feel free to grab food. If you have eaten, please feel free to grab more food for as long as it's there. So it makes for a nice evening, a nice tabletop conversation. Before I go any further, I do want to announce that we have council members Sue Beckmeyer here, and Councilmember Sue Vaterlos here. While all 5 council members would like to be at this meeting observing, only 2 at a time can be here because of Brown Act limitations. So I just wanted to make sure that you understand that and why all 5 are not here at the same time. They will be not participating in conversation, but walking around and observing and listening. And I think that without further ado, I want to introduce Planning Director Christian Murdoch, and he's going to introduce staff and start with a presentation, and let's get going. And again, I just have to say thank you for being here, and this kind of format really lends itself to honest and open conversation with neighbors. Maybe you know, maybe you don't know them. Tonight you'll get to meet them and really be honest, be authentic in your conversations, and that's what it's all about. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin, and good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to see all of you. And like any good meeting back in person after COVID, we're having technical difficulties since the setup. So I will need just a second to try to get my computer unfrozen and the presentation going again. All right, looks like we're back. So as Kevin mentioned, it's very exciting to be here together with all of you. Many familiar faces that have been in similar meetings like this in the past, speaking about housing, why are we here, how did we get here, and what do we do about the current housing crisis that so many of us are suffering from. And so tonight we're going to go over an introduction to the housing element and the update process that the city is undertaking. We're going to talk about Pacifica's Regional Housing Needs Allocation, or RHNA. That's the city's obligation to plan for a certain number of housing units for the next 8-year housing element period. We're going to talk about strategies that the city can use to achieve its obligations to plan for the RHNA. And then we're going to hopefully get some good feedback from you, our community, about those strategies that we've identified, any others that we should think of, or those that maybe don't look or feel right for our community. Before we get rolling, we had a nice dinner period, but you may not have all met one another. So let's just take 2 minutes, turn to the person on either side of you, introduce yourself and let them know how long you've lived or worked in Pacifica. Let's warm it up and get ready for the presentation and the group conversations. How about you, Arlene? All right. Thanks so much. Hopefully you met someone new or found something out about someone you know that you didn't know before tonight. So first, I want to provide an overview of what a housing element is. It's part of the city's general plan. The general plan is a document the city is required by law to have adopted. It has a number of required elements, things like land use, safety, all the way across to housing, of course, which is the subject of tonight's conversation. It requires an analysis of housing needs, constraints, identification of sites to plan for a particular target of housing units. It requires goals, policies, and programs to implement development and approval of those housing units, as well as reduction or elimination of barriers to people obtaining quality, affordable housing. And this go around, there's a special emphasis on fair housing, environmental justice, and community input. In other words, hearing from you, the Pacifica community, as to whether the housing element is achieving everything that the community needs from it. And tonight, our focus is on the highlighted item here, which is an identification of sites, which is really sort of the headline topic, if you will, for the housing element process. Everyone thinks about sites, they see the big number, and they wonder, oh my gosh, what are we going to do about it? And so tonight, we're going to take some initial steps to figure out what are we going to do about it. And so the housing element, as mentioned, requires public input, study and analysis of the city's policies and programs, whether it's zoning, fees, open space requirements, street paving requirements in association with development, everything that can affect the affordability or feasibility of someone undertaking a housing project. There's, of course, technical studies about population, projections, housing needs, income levels, so on and so on. Anything that you can imagine being relevant to the construction or development of housing needs to be analyzed to some extent in the housing element, and a determination needs to be made, is this obstructing the city's ability to provide its required number of housing units? And so all of that goes into a draft document. It's released to the public. You'll have an opportunity to review and comment on it, and then the city will consider all of that feedback and then send that document off to the state to determine whether the state believes that the city's housing element would meet, or what's known as substantially comply with state housing element law. The key agency, and you'll hear me say it a number of times tonight, is the California Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD. They are the state agency that's empowered under state law to make determinations about local agency housing elements and whether they are substantially compliant or not with state housing element law. And what you'll see, in Pacifica, I'm sure, and elsewhere in San Mateo County and the Bay Area, is cities are going through this process right now of sending their draft housing elements to the state. They're getting lengthy letters saying, hey, you need to change this, that, and the other thing. And so this really is an iterative process with the city staff, HCD, and the community. And so we're not going to answer all of the questions tonight, but we do need to begin that iterative process so you can hear from the city what the requirements are, and then we can discuss options as a community of what we can do about it and the strategies that we can put into place. And so after we go through that iterative process with the state, it may require more than one submission. We'll get to a point where they will tell us, if you adopt your housing element as you've submitted it to HCD, it will be in substantial compliance, and then we will take it to the city council for a final action to approve it, at which time it becomes part of our general plan and one of the several elements that's in the city's 2040 general plan that will guide the city's ongoing activities. And so the housing element update process, what does that mean exactly? So pursuant to state law, Pacifica and all other local agencies, cities and counties in California, are required to update their housing elements every 8 years. And so different regions of the state have different planning periods. That's the 8-year period in which the housing element must be approved and cover the housing projections. In the Bay Area, we're currently in the 2015 to 2023 planning period, which means the new housing element needs to be approved and in place in 2023 to cover that 8-year period through 2031. And so we launched this housing element update process for what's known as the 6th cycle, or cycle 6, Regional Housing Needs Allocation or Housing Element Update, in August. We presented a community outreach strategy to the City Council. We received feedback, including, hey, we need to have another community meeting because we all need to get together, make sure as many people as possible can hear this information and offer their input. And so tonight is the second of 3 community meetings, and we'll talk more about the third at the end of the meeting. Throughout September, we conducted a number of background studies, we gathered information, we really put a key strategy together, not only for community engagement, but with the help of our consultants and multiple city staff, put together the building blocks and the plan as to how we're going to undertake the housing element update process. Now, here we are in October. We are in the concepts phase where we need to discuss strategies in particular, as mentioned, for housing sites, and conduct these in-person community meetings to vet those with you, our community. The process will then churn through a number of internal drafts and additional work items for the city staff to hopefully put out that draft document for your review in the early part of 2023. And so the key takeaways as we think about the big picture requirement for the city as part of this 6th cycle housing element update process is that RHNAs are increasing, particularly in the Bay Area and particularly in cities that have a lot of amenities and opportunity like the city of Pacifica. And so when we received our RHNA allocation, sure enough, the RHNA increased substantially, nearly 5 times what it was for the 2015 to 2023 planning period, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Additionally, because of the ongoing housing crisis across the state, the California legislature has ratcheted up the pressure on cities with respect to their housing elements. And they've put into place a number of new legal requirements and also directed HCD, the California Department of Housing and Community Development, to look at agencies' housing elements very carefully. What may have been acceptable in the fifth cycle back in 2015 isn't going to pass muster in the sixth cycle. And so we've been put on notice by the state, along with all of our other partner agencies, that we're going to have to work really hard, and we're going to have to probably go beyond our comfort zone a little bit in terms of planning, policies, and programs. In particular, there's a new focus on what's known as Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, or AFFH. That's an obligation for the city to consider would any policies in the housing element, including site identification, any policies, programs, or requirements, would they increase burdens on vulnerable populations, or would they increase segregation in any way, or reinforce historic patterns of segregation, which unfortunately are a vestige of policy decisions made decades ago. And so you'll hear us talk a little bit about that in this presentation, but that's going to be sort of an overarching theme as the city prepares this draft for public review. And then the last key theme is the number 30. It's a magic number, if you will, for this housing element update. With the big increase in the requirement to plan for affordable housing units, this number 30 is the minimum density of dwelling units per acre that the city is going to need to identify in its housing element in order for HCD to accept certain housing sites as appropriate for lower income housing units. And so that's going to be a central theme when we talk about the site strategies, along with some other requirements and constraints, which we'll get to in a moment. So here's a chart comparing the city's fifth cycle, or RENA 5, housing allocation, to the sixth cycle, or RENA 6. You can see, it's obvious, the red number is a lot higher, right? The bar has been raised, if you will, figuratively and literally, in terms of the number of housing units the city has to plan for this next 8-year period. Our overall allocation in 2015 was 413 units. In RENA 6 for 2023 and beyond, it's 1,892 housing units. As I mentioned, nearly 5 times greater than the last allocation. And so not only will we have to plan for more units, but as mentioned, the criteria and the scrutiny of our decisions to identify sites for those units will be drastically higher and stricter scrutiny. And so, when we get down into the subunits, which is difficult to see perhaps on your screen, but moderate, low, and very low income units, those will have additional requirements and criteria that will guide our options for identifying appropriate sites. And so this is why we need community input, because we're going to be asked to do things that we haven't done in the past, including increased density, including identifying more sites, including determining where those sites are so that they don't aggravate past segregation or racial separation and so on. And so what we're doing in this housing element update is not trying to start from scratch. We are trying to build on the wonderful community input we've received through prior work. This has included the 2019 Home for All conversations, which many of you were a part of. There were 2 community conversations on housing, one at the community center and one at Ingram B. Lacey Middle School. Some key takeaways and the input that really jumped out at me from those engagements. I'll just read a few of the quotes that we received from the community. I'm losing the ability to continue to live in the community I grew up in with the people I grew up with. I want to stay, but I can't. We pay more than 50% of our net income for rent and probably can't hold on much longer. And the one that's most striking to me as a father is, my children can't afford to stay here. And so you do all that work to raise them and to invest them in this community, only to have them grow up and not be able to afford their own place to live. And so I feel like those are all things that we should be concerned about and we should want to work together to address. We also have carried into this process feedback we received from the community during the general plan update process and the Sharp Park specific plan. Again, many of you were involved in those processes, and the general plan in particular we know was a challenging process, but we listened and we have tried to incorporate as much feedback as we could from the community about your concerns related to housing, the environment, open space, and so on. And so what we've done is tried to take all of that feedback and distill it into the simplest terms that we can to have, text on paper, if you will, to guide our actions and our decision making. And so what we've heard is common concerns about housing. I think So many of you agree that we want everyone to have a place to live here in Pacifica. We want to be a welcoming community. But you're concerned about transportation impacts. Traffic, obviously. Parking. Will these new units have enough vehicles, places to park their vehicles so that they're not crowding up our streets? Perfectly reasonable concerns. We hear you, and we will do all that we can to address those concerns. We've also heard that many of you want to increase vibrancy in your community. Some neighborhoods need to be more walkable. You want more arts and more activities for yourselves and for your children. More things to do so you don't have to drive so far away to entertain yourselves or to enrich yourselves culturally. We've also heard common values, and this is really where the rubber meets the road for the housing element, because this influences the strategies that we as a community can accept. And those include trying to maintain our small town feel, ensuring that we embrace and interact with and hopefully have a seamless relationship with our coastal environment. We want to protect our open space and our hillsides. We want to increase walkability, increase diversity, and maintain the diversity that we do have. And then lastly, increase and provide housing for all ages and all incomes. We have a strong history of promoting senior housing and trying to have beautiful, vibrant communities and children and a safe place to raise our families. And so we hear that, and we've tried to incorporate as much of that as possible into the strategies to meet our planning obligations for housing. As at the culmination of the Home for All process, the community also coalesced around a number of housing strategies, right? Wanting housing or conceiving of housing is one thing, but ultimately that needs to become a building of some type that someone can live in and have shelter and protection and security. And so the community said that they supported and believed in mixed-use development. So making good use of our space, having commercial so that we have jobs and we have shopping opportunities that keep us local and keep our dollars in Pacifica, and then have housing be a part of those developments. We've heard the focus should be on infill development. Let's protect our open spaces and our hillsides and those undeveloped lands that have been protected thus far from development. Let's conserve as many of those as we can and focus infill on vacant lots and other places right on the edge of existing development. We've heard workforce housing is important. We need to make sure that people that are important to our community, teachers, first responders, and others, grocery store workers, everyone that makes our community livable, they should be able to have a place here in Pacifica as well. Affordable housing, which can mean a lot of different things, but really this means rent or purchase prices that are affordable to people with low and moderate incomes. And those are technical terms, but I think the value speaks for itself in terms of the types of projects that we want. Also senior housing and accessory dwelling units or ADUs. And so this is a really wonderful menu of options for the city to work with. And we're going to talk about strategies that would allow all of those to occur in the housing element. We also heard about duplex, triplex, fourplex developments. In other words, taking a single family home and allowing additional units to be constructed on that existing single family property so that we're, in a sense, transitioning away from single family only development and zoning, and at least having a greater mix of housing unit types. We are not going to talk much about that in the housing element or tonight because the state, since hearing that feedback, has enacted a law known as SB 9 or Senate Bill 9, which largely accomplishes that objective. It provides a legal pathway for properties that are single family zoned to have a duplex or in some instances a triplex or a fourplex. And so we don't think that we need to create the process or the strategy for that. In any case, it's not going to give us enough units realistically to achieve our large arena. We also aren't going to spend time tonight talking about tiny homes, which was a supported strategy by the community. Again, there just won't be enough of them to move the needle, if you will, on our planning obligations. And there's also some ongoing legal and regulatory hurdles that really prevent that from being a viable strategy at this point in time in Pacifica. And then lastly, we heard support for home sharing and co-housing, which are not strategies or types of housing. They're ways that you manage and live within housing that's already been constructed. And so for those reasons, those aren't housing types or strategies that we've tried to incorporate in the housing element as one of our key strategies. So while we've done our best to articulate what we've heard from the community in terms of values that can inform strategies, we don't have a blank canvas. There are a number of key assumptions that the city has to take into account and a number of key limitations pursuant to state law and regulations, put forth by HCD, again, the California Housing and Community Development Department. The first is that the city needs to incorporate reasonable assumptions with respect to the densities at which projects will be approved. We can't just say, oh, we've planned for 30 dwelling units per acre and we're going to assume every project's coming in at 30 dwelling units per acre. Not realistic, because other considerations in terms of product type, the need to provide parking, open spaces, a variety of factors can result in projects coming in below the maximum allowable density. And in fact, as we've studied projects that have been approved over the last several years, the average density was 81% of the maximum. And so that's an adjustment we have to make to all of our assumed densities for projects. The next is assumptions related to lower income housing units. So in addition to the 30 dwelling units per acre or more that we need to assume for density, the state has also said that we need to find sites that are a half acre or larger, but not larger than 10 acres. And so we all know that we have a lot of very small sites in Pacifica and a lot of very big sites. Many of those being our open space areas and our hillside areas that we want to protect and not direct housing to be constructed. So we've had our work cut out for us finding sites that are a half acre or larger, and we haven't really run into many issues of finding sites that are larger than 10 acres that also are consistent with the community's values. But that's a really important one, because we can't pick and choose a lot of 5,000 square foot lots to provide affordable housing. And so that will be important when we talk about strategies. And then additionally, the state through HCD is going to put our housing element site selections through additional scrutiny if more than 50% of our lower income housing sites are already developed with some other type of use. So what the state's saying is, lower income housing sites need all the help they can get to make the finances work, right? They're already charging less for the purchase or for the rent. We need to reduce the costs of developing, including demolishing and remediating already developed sites. So if more than half of our sites end up on non-vacant sites, which is highly probable, we're going to have to, again, raise the bar in terms of our justification and analysis. And so in Pacifica, we have relatively few vacant non-hillside sites. And so that's a challenge for us. The next is ADUs. Time and time again, I've heard from folks, I support housing, and the housing type I want is ADUs because it's not going to have a big impact. It's not going to change the feel and character of our neighborhood. And so that's the strategy that I like the most. And I hear you. But unfortunately, the state has said, well, we're not going to solve the housing crisis through ADUs alone. They're an important tool in the toolbox, but you need to look at how many ADUs you've approved over the last 4 or 5 years and calculate that average, and that's what we're going to allow you to count each year for your 8-year housing element. And so for us, that ends up being around 160 housing units. And so when you compare that to our 1,892 units of housing we have to plan for, it's less than 10% of the solution. And so I need to get that out there up front so we don't put too much emphasis and weight on that particular strategy. Much of our community is in the coastal zone, and so coastal hazards are a very relevant factor for planning for housing. And so we need to identify sites that if we're going to intensify them beyond their current density, the Coastal Commission is going to require that they are outside of coastal hazard zones. Most notable, in my opinion, sea level rise projections. Over the life of these projects, we want to do our best to make sure that they're protected and not vulnerable. And so that really limits the number of requiring us to identify more sites outside the coastal zone. But it's an important constraint, and we've identified it, and so let's keep that in mind. And then lastly on this slide, a concept called no net loss. And what that means is, it's great at that particular point in time when you approve the housing element to say, look, we've planned for all of our units. Aren't we special? Well, you are at that point in time. But after that housing element adoption, the city will, of course, over time approve projects. And as I mentioned, not all of those projects are going to develop at the maximum density, and not all of them are even going to develop at the assumed 81% of density. Some may come in lower, some may come in without any affordable housing units at all, or fewer affordable housing units than we had hoped for. And so what the state's saying is throughout the entire 8-year period that your housing element covers, you need to make sure you stay at or above that line. The number of units cannot drop below that line for each of the income categories. And so we address that in a couple of different ways. The recommended way is to put a buffer. So while we have to plan for at least 1,892 units In reality, the sensible and practical and prudent approach is to have some number, and the state's recommended between 15 and 30% above that minimum planning obligation, so that when you approve one project, you don't immediately have to go and undertake a rezoning to find another site. It's a really inefficient process, and it's one that I think can put the community through a lot of tumult unnecessarily. And so if we can do our work now and make the tough choices now, we can have the appropriate margin so that we can approve good housing projects and not run afoul of our planning obligations. And so for us, a 15% buffer would be another 284 units, and a 30% buffer will be another 568 units. And then, again, this umbrella concept of affirmatively furthering fair housing is going to show itself in all of our decisions within the housing element process, particularly in the site selection, as well as in our policies and programs that we have to analyze and put into place. And so it's a lot of text here, but what it really boils down to, as it's defined in state law, is combating discrimination and not exacerbating existing patterns of segregation. And so we need to foster inclusive communities that are free from those negative aspects and implications of segregation and racially driven decision making. And so we will need to think about that, and it extends to all of our activities with respect to housing and community development. And so to help visualize that, it's a little bit ambiguous in a sense, but here's one lens through which we will be looking at affirmatively furthering fair housing. And what this map shows is the bold lines are our city limits for Pacifica, and it shows a continuum from the lightest colors being the lowest diversity to the darkest green color being the highest diversity. And so we can see, based on these census block groups here, that different parts of our communities have different degrees of racial diversity. And so that's something that we'll need to keep in mind. And particularly, we can't put all of the affordable housing units in these areas that are already the least diverse, the highest diversity. So we need to make sure that we're reducing patterns of segregation and discriminatory decision making. This is similar information, just portrayed in a different way. And what this map shows is census block groups that are majority white. And it goes from the slimmest majority, which is less than 10% majority white, to the predominant white of greater than 50%. So the majority of the census tract area being majority white. And so again, it shows that different parts of our community have different degrees of majority white ethnic population. And so this is yet another dimension among many dimensions that we'll have to look at in terms of affirmatively furthering fair housing. Beyond racial issues, there are issues related to educational and economic opportunity and a number of other factors as well. And so what all of this has come to, sort of at the focal point of our discussion tonight, is 6 strategies that the city staff and its consultants have conceived of based on your community values, the constraints that we have, and the realistic timeline and options that we have for achieving our planning obligations. And so I'll go through briefly examples of each of these with a disclaimer that a property's inclusion in this presentation tonight does not mean that the property owner supports or has asked to be in the presentation or in the housing element. We've looked far and wide in Pacifica for sites that have the potential to meet our housing obligations. And so we really do need to have an objective, far-reaching view of what our options are so that we can, as a community, can decide how we're going to fulfill our obligations. And so with that, the starting point for this conversation from our perspective is the 2040 general plan that the City Council adopted to replace our 40-plus-year-old 1980 general plan earlier this year. And a number of land use changes were made in that document, which increased densities in a number of places. And one of those is the Park Mall Shopping Center, which overall is a little under 6 acres. And in the yellow highlighted area is a little under 2 acres. Those are the parts of the Park Mall site that we think has the potential, based on the various criteria that these housing sites will be subjected to in their scrutiny by the state, has the potential to be a viable housing site. A portion of that is an undeveloped parcel on the site, and the rest of it is parking area where no buildings are present. And so with the existing general plan designation, there's the potential on this site for 46 dwelling units. And so as you can see here with the pie chart, and you'll see it on each subsequent slide with each strategy, use of existing general plan land use designations, putting them through the filter of site assumptions and scrutiny and restrictions and limitations, we can achieve, we estimate, 22% of our arena with the existing general plan. What that means is 78% requires new innovations in terms of land use, decision-making, and sites identification. So Park Mall is in the Park Pacifica neighborhood at Oddstadt Boulevard and Terra Nova Boulevard. Yeah. Gas station. So who's taking the liability on that? So to my knowledge, they've completed the remediation required for the closure, and so I'm not aware that there's any ongoing specific environmental contamination at the site that would preclude development of that site. The possibility exists, certainly, but they fulfilled their obligations, to my knowledge, under environmental health regulations for the closure of the gas station. I don't know all the answers with respect to the individual project financing. What the city has control over is the land use regulations that would guide the development and the ability for a housing project to be undertaken. So I want to get through the presentation. What I would ask is if you have questions, refer them to your table facilitators. I will be floating dwelling units. As we talked about, ADUs are an important tool, but they're not going to get us all the way there in terms of our housing obligation. So our average is 161 dwelling units. And so, our average is roughly 20 dwelling units per year for ADUs, times 8 years for the housing element cycle. Around 160 units can go towards our housing obligations. And so that's about 8.5% of our arena, not even a full 10% double-digit contribution. And so it's a small but important part. The next thing we've heard is shopping centers and commercial properties. Let's redevelop those, and let's put mixed-use housing. Great strategy. This is an example here. If the city were to change the Lindemar Shopping Center to a mixed-use designation, we've identified the yellow highlighted portions, about 4.6 acres, that may be viable for purposes of a housing element site. Changing from retail commercial, which doesn't allow housing in the general plan, to either mixed-use neighborhood or mixed-use commercial, which are our two primary mixed-use designations, could yield anywhere from 112 units to 186 housing units. And so even on this very large site, you'll see that we're not gaining significant numbers of units given the assumptions and the restrictions on sites. Nevertheless, it's important to find every qualifying site, and this is one example. And so utilizing parking areas on the site that aren't currently developed, we could provide anywhere from 112 to 186 units. And applying these strategies to shopping centers we think have viability in the housing element process, we can get about 13% of our arena. That was shocking to me, I'll admit it. I thought we would get far more housing units by looking at our shopping centers, but those that are already mixed use are covered in the 2040 general plan strategy, and those that we think are viable at this point in time, get us 13%. Important, but not comprehensive. And the other shopping centers we looked at for this purpose were the Fairmont Shopping Center and Seabowl as a commercial property. The next strategy is public property sites. As a community, we are all going to need to do our part, not just private property owners, but public property owners as well. And so we looked at one example, Jefferson Union High School District property, the Oceana High School site. A lot of land at that site. It's 51 acres. We've identified 7.5 acres that we think have the potential to be a qualifying housing site. Applying those densities we talked about, 30 acres to 50 units per acre, not in mixed use in this instance. This could be, and is in this concept, residential only. This could yield anywhere from 182 to around 300 dwelling units. So even such a large site, we're getting units in chunks, and so we really have to add them all together. And then, reflecting the values and constraints, there's some steepness on the edges of the site And so, we're trying to avoid the steepest parts of that property. The next public property site, it's a city-owned site. It's the city's existing corporation yard at Oceana and Malagra. That's less than an acre. It's more than that half-acre threshold, so it's important for us to take a look. The development potential there, in this case, thinking of a mixed-use concept, is anywhere from 20 to 33 dwelling units. This, has a constraint in that it's already developed and it would require relocation of the city's corporation yard. And so, the city is doing its part to try to find properties that it owns that could be, added into the mix and be part of the solution for the community. This is a very important strategy, public property, in particular given the large acreages involved with some of the high school properties, for example. And so this strategy could yield us, we estimate, up to 25% of our arena for meeting our obligations. The next strategy is Caltrans opportunity sites. Some people call them excess right-of-way or surplus land, whatever you call them. There are not very many available that would also be consistent with a lot of the values that we've identified as a community. One unique site that we've identified for purposes of tonight is a portion of the Skyline right-of-way just south of Hickey Boulevard. And the reason for that is not only because it's a large site in the sense that overall it's 9.3 acres. There's a portion of that, the northernmost 5 acres, that's directly adjacent to the Villages at Pacifica apartment complex. And many of you don't know, or many of you may not know, I should say, that used to be known as the Marymount Summit Gateway Apartments. It changed ownership a couple years ago to now be known as Villages at Pacifica. And that property was purchased by an affordable housing developer and operator. And so the city entered into what's known as an affordability agreement with them to actually allow them to rent 168 out of the 170 units at affordable rents. And so that property owner is interested in developing that Caltrans right-of-way into more affordable housing if we can make it work from the state in terms of a housing element site, and also with Caltrans going through their process to dispose of the property. And so we think it's unique and it's got potential. That could get anywhere from 122 to 203 dwelling units. And this one's of particular importance as well for affordable housing because it's an undeveloped/vacant site. All told, we think Caltrans sites can yield about 6% of our planning obligation. And then to round things out, we talked earlier about the coastal zone. And so recognizing there are constraints in terms of coastal hazards, sea level rise projections, and others, also trying to avoid hillsides and the like, the existing commercial properties on San Pedro Avenue, just south of the Pedro Point Shopping Center. This is a site, an example of where a little over 2 acres, currently designated retail commercial. If it were to be mixed use or housing, it could yield anywhere from around 50 to around 90 housing units. And using strategies within the coastal zone could yield about 11% of our arena. And so to tie all of that together, what it means is the 6 strategies we've identified that we think are consistent with the community's values can address around 86% of our housing obligations. However, more than half of those units that we've identified require new actions by the city to change its general plan and zoning to accommodate housing at all, because they're non-housing sites currently, or more housing than would already be accommodated. That will, add around 1,000 new housing units. However, we need to identify additional sites that we haven't yet found a strategy to identify for another 14% or around 265 more housing units. And so the next sort of addition to that process, again, is the no net loss. And so if we're being responsible, and as I expect the state will require from us, we need to identify a buffer on top of that. At the low end, 15%, based on the state's recommendation, that's another 284 units. Going up to the top end of their recommendation is another 568 units. And probably will come down, I hope, somewhere in the middle, so that we can be responsible, but also not go beyond what the reasonable expectation is. And so it's with that in mind, the fact that we are going to need all of the strategies we have identified and your insights and feedback into potential new strategies, that we're going to, in a moment, continue our small group conversations from prior engagements. And so For those of you at tables that don't have a full lineup, city staff will be coming by in just a moment to ask some of you to relocate so we can have full tables. We are limited tonight on the number of facilitators for our conversations, and so we ask that you try to be efficient and cooperative and let us all get started in just a moment. I do also want to point out, not all of our facilitators are in the planning department, and so I will be floating around available to them and to you if questions come up. So please bear with us. There's only one of me, but I will make my way around wherever there's a hand raised and try to answer your questions so you can give us the feedback that we need for tonight.
Oh my God. We'll count us here to defend us right now. Like they grab Oh, yeah, yeah.
There's a few of us with two tables. So we're going to have a conversation starting out. Hope everybody can respect everybody's opinion. Everybody has to speak. We are going to talk about strategy levels. I'm not technical information behind that at this time. If you have questions, you have to write them down. I'll come back. But I think our strategy, how we can move forward with what we're doing. So,
It would be helpful to level set in terms of some of those. I mean, I'm guides, housing elements, right? Some of these constraints must be less, more than 5 acre, less than 10 acre. And some of these constraints that seem like they're assumptions based on here, but I can find
Again, my name's Anthony Schreiber.
so it would be super helpful so that, and also you know, the whole point in all this legislation is about paying for housing. Speaks to like the primary issue with the housing development is to also identify constraints, right? Just so that we're not wasting everybody's time and having people, you know, having developers be led to believe that they should be developing in a wetland and having us argue over where the wetland is as opposed to like, hey, let's have a shared framework so that we can agree from the get-go and have a shared framework, right? Rather than trying to cherry pick over certain, you know, certain properties, whether it's the best place to implement, we're still missing, shopping market.
Right, so I don't disagree with that point that understanding constraints and limitations is going to be an important factor for this. We're unable to get to that site level detail tonight. Okay, so what I think would be most effective for this conversation and for our purposes of giving feedback on what our community is looking for with development, understanding how to move forward with the constraints, information, and those assumptions. If you'd like back up on how we got those understandings and how those kind of make Christian maybe more familiar with the exact citations, or we can follow up with you later.
So the feedback you're looking for is just how we feel about what's been presented,
I'm
or
happy to-
problem solving or input about where that extra housing
Yeah,
is?
can't. So let me present the question and then we'll give everybody a chance to respond to it. So the first point of feedback that I'm looking to get is your reactions to the strategies that were identified. Let's start with the 2040 general plan settings. Do we have any reactions to what Christian presented on that idea? Is it positive? Is it something that the city is going to that you guys are supportive of, that we move forward with? Finding that the core goals of what we've heard in the past are
Correct,
I'm assuming those are already articulated, those are already incorporated into the general plan.
Yeah.
Which is to say that I think they've already been the subject of a lot of analysis, so it makes sense to me that we would base all of our work on the notion that we've got those sites already identified.
Any other thoughts about the general plan sites?
So we identified like 1,000, right? There's like 800 more we need to find. Is that basically?
I think I do have questions about the sites that were already identified, only because I don't think that they were mutually agreed on as like the best sites, and I'm questioning the assumptions made on the maximum density that you can build on the shopping center and some of the other sites, the Caltrans, like they only get us to 6.4% or 25% of our HNA. What are the constraints to doing those deeper density or higher?
Fire department, sewer service, electrical, roads.
So are those things that could be considered a modified to do deeper density in some of those sites? Like why are we assuming the constraints are permanent constraints, and are there solutions around like height limitations? But we can change and re-vote on height limitations, but we're making these like fixed assumptions, and I'm questioning the fixed assumptions before we move off to say where else. I'm questioning the limitations on what's already been identified.
So you're suggesting like shopping centers and commercial, for example, could be more densely developed than as was presented today?
Yeah, I'm just wondering what are the limitations to doing that, because those are already.
Parking would be the biggest one. It's like Park Mall, Livermore.
And there's lots of city sites that are dense housing, but they don't provide it. So again, these are all limitations that are kind of manufactured limitations. I'm just trying to free out the limitations. What can we consider? What are some of the?
Shopping center privately owned.
Yeah.
So if the guy who owns it doesn't want to do it, then just scrap it. That's not going to happen, right?
Oh wait, no, I'm not saying, but I'm just saying, these are already identified here.
Yeah, I'm just saying you're wondering how you can make it work. First of all, probably be willing to do this, right? He's got to put
Well,
a lot
all
of
of
money
that,
into it.
who's willing, right? But this is what we're saying is that these are the limitations that are set. We don't get to the quantity because we can't get there with these, but I'm questioning why can't we get there with these?
So this is based on a preliminary review of the sites which is identified in our general plan to maybe accommodate for higher density.
Yeah.
As was mentioned, with consideration of parking, height limitations, even if it is about 35 feet. you know, we have open space requirements on sites, access, sure, fire access, these kind of like, requirements, put some limitations that we had to manage what we could assume on these sites, and that seemed reasonable at a preliminary plan. So, but the reasons why you're saying there are limits are because all of those limitations you just mentioned. Some of the other sites that were identified, for instance, that they had pointed here, in order to make that site available to build on, you have to change your limits. You have to change your zoning. You have to change the land use designation. Currently, you can't. So you're changing the assumption to fit the needs. I'm saying that can be applied to these as well. You're changing your limits. Okay, so what I'm hearing from you is you're open to allowing a higher density, putting more density at these sites to close up that gap. Is that
Where there's existing CRMU, these are all sites where there's existing CRMU. You haven't changed anything to CRMU to accommodate it, it's already existing. And maybe since those are already commercial sites, residential mixed-use sites existing, those could maybe be considered for a higher density.
Okay, so that's, you're saying CRMU, meaning the coastal,
We're talking about these existing sites where there's already development, shopping centers, commercial.
You know, let's work with our land use designation.
The question is just in terms of what we're trying to do with respect to these questions. I mean, what I understood you were trying to get at was, do we have a reaction to, it's going to take an array of strategies to get to the number of units that we need to get to in order to satisfy the need. And I guess I understood the question to be, how do we, putting aside for the specific sites, and we can have a lot of arguments about what sites are appropriate for projects at all, but what's our reaction to the various strategies that are identified here? Recognizing that
That was my reaction to the strategy, where we've got these artificial limits. Maybe we have to like rethink what the limits are and why they're there.
whether we do X thing with respect to shopping centers or commercial or not, I think it's manifestly obvious we're going to have to do something. I think it's manifestly obvious we're going to have to take a look at the coastal zone. Now, whether we build anything in the coastal zone or not is ultimately an open question. A lot of constraints. I've been involved in a lot of projects involving the coastal zone. But it seems to me that every one of these strategies needs to be on the table, in my opinion.
No project.
Well, no,
Let's get that straight, right?
okay.
Just because you talk about
That's
it
why
doesn't
we're here tonight, because of the lack of building.
Well, it's challenging everywhere. I've been, but I do think every one of those strategies needs to be looked closely.
So we have to assume that, we were wondering about
That's been assigned by the.
yeah. And above,
buffer, right?
Yeah.
And then if we're short, we also should have a strategy to deal with the ramifications.
Well, yeah, we're short. We're going to end up with a situation where maybe builders are going to be able to come in and build whatever they want, pursuant to a builder's remedy. So I don't think that we really want a situation where we haven't identified units that meet our remit. So.
my understanding is that we don't have someone else.
So I know we jumped to C, so Eureka Square is one of them that you guys mentioned about the shopping center. Why is that? Okay, any other shopping centers?
I don't think so. It's interesting to see where HCD has come in and taken movement away from cities. It's where cities have identified places. And this is why it goes back to constraints, where there were clear constraints in the ground, right? And the city just was ignoring those. And that's what I'm concerned about, is that, like, we increase density where it would be realistic to do so based on the conditions on the ground. And based on what people that who live there are saying, like, when we're saying water seeps there year round, that is hard. And I think that's why there's some concern. Or when we say there are red-legged frogs, that, and I documented this with 15 different neighbors on 25 occasions, that, there isn't any denial. Like, I'm concerned as a state regulator that we're losing our our ability to retain what we control if we continuously have easily flammable and easily, propose developments that are frequently easy and easy to follow. So I'm really hoping too that we can just work on that.
Okay, so this is all great value. I want to make sure everybody gets this talk. Was hoping to this last night into a question. So back to the general plan sites, I heard reactions that let's add more density to the existing sites. More supportive of that. Does anybody else have a reaction to general plan sites and that strategy?
Yeah, not the soccer fields are in great shape.
I don't have a choice.
Yeah.
By the dog park back there, Sanchez Art Studio, and all that thing, it's a monopoly.
Was that the flood zone,
To enhance capacity.
Yeah, that's something, let's see.
What about the trails behind the safe, the Lincoln Safety Shopping Center?
Right, but if it just goes further down, and we use the density band to
San Pedro, sorry.
as opposed to why are they there? And we look at what is causing those actions, are those things changeable if they were voted on?
But even, no, I'm thinking of between the highway and Safe Road, there's that trail that goes back there.
Yeah, so
Funny enough, that is actually
Wait, where do you mean?
Yeah, they built some new houses over there. Recently.
You mean San Pedro Terrace?
Yeah, there's a,
Is that by the old folks home?
yes, there's a,
That's San Pedro Terrace.
I assume they were all looking at it. Now whether they would all.
the idea
You have to cross over the creek. More than two, like 5 or 6, yeah. What about part of the Atlantic, like the part of
What I heard was in your calculations for maximum density, that density is based on a factor that can be modified. You change whatever you can change. Now, did we make some assumptions that put lids on how much we could increase our latitude here in a certain you want to look at the assumptions of how much you could change the variables that are in there.
that is something we can look at. I think we're saying the same thing, yeah.
And that we got all the shopping centers here. It wasn't just an example, but they were.
Well, let's present an example, whether it's an example of preliminary review of that idea at our shopping center.
All shopping centers were included in that calculation.
I assume so. I wasn't provided that background, but yeah. And in general, yes, that's a good point. If not, why not? And are those variables that could also be reconsidered or reconfigured? Could the rules change if we are voting on the rules? Are there constraints that we can change? And those are things that we'll look at as we get further support of that strategy. One thing I just asked
this is all very good feedback, yeah. You guys this is great,
Been here 39 years, ride around and hike around and
economically unreasonable, unfeasible in terms of the assumptions that we're making as we, or the assumptions that we must change, or together, people are gonna build to that, or that site is gonna be saying that work. So I think we have to be really careful about that in terms of, changing the box too much. Because people are gonna say that's not a box that is economically rational.
These are workshops, and this is feedback, right? We're not here to tell you how to do your job, we're giving you feedback on the job you're doing. So that's feedback.
Why didn't we touch on
I'm saying, I'm not saying you specifically, John, I'm just saying in general, that you know, that's what I'm saying. Like, we're not here to like be the experts and tell you how to solve the problems. This is the community input, and we're giving feedback.
I have a question that's.
I'm hearing a few people saying some of the feedback is,
Are there no amounts
we're thinking inside the box, but who does that box? Can we change the construction in the box? Does the box have a wing? You know, that's, it's like, can we free ourselves from constraints? Maybe the answer is yes or no, but I think that's what you're
square footage, square acreage, and everybody gets the same cookie cutter? Well, we can't do that. We've got hills and we've got other property, other people that are owning all of our property.
So, how left out of the conversation, how?
The biggest piece of property. Is that because our problem is the fact that it has to do with or something? Is this
But they have to look at other factors besides that.
I think that the regulatory is the size that is our.
Seems like there should be some caveats.
So it's outside of the debate that we need for
This
but it is a big splash to pay that all the time to our credit. It just may not be our best focused planning strategy to solve all those problems. But I think that
By the time you include all that, there's not much.
that also goes back to what Sheree was saying.
Oh, it
Like,
is.
where is that basis of the less than 5 and more than 10 coming from? That's another assumption, right? So we're questioning that, like, why is that right? Why does it have to be?
from that.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was the point I was gonna make. Why is there a
What do I
maximum
know? I'm not
size
educated. I'm
that
just
can
saying in that area. I'm just saying that this is.
high density housing, whatever, or bigger, larger than this amount, but then also smaller than this amount? Why do you make it smaller?
Elaborate. We're kind of bouncing around, so they're trying to take it big as they can feedback.
There's one thing that I wanted to add to that was G, which is.
Yeah, those are very important sites because it allows us to rent properties in the school districts and development. The issue is there's things like community extension, also inside sites, sites. So one of the last questions is any specific sites you can think of where housing should be jotted down. Yeah. Was there another question over here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It also doesn't feel like we build all these houses and they all turn into Airbnbs. I love it. So I think
It has to be but we have the few.
That's for a separate conversation.
I agree, but it's all going to go to hell in a handbasket if you build it all and it's still being like.
What about, because the tax is not.
So less than that, like, it's within statute that a housing element needs to include an assessment of the resource constraint, and the fact that almost all new resources get taken off the table right away by vacationers is something we should at least.
Which page?
So you can generate revenue. There's a certain area where mostly the city needs money.
Well, if you're already trying to generate revenue, by building houses, that should generate revenue. It doesn't mean, you have some tax money that spending it back, right, and it gets eaten up by all the additional resources that you have to devote to maintaining it. So that's never going to be the solution to Pacifica's rent.
What's the solution? More commercial?
I think we're going to have some smart business development. Business development planning.
Right, that's fine. Yes.
Look at daily cities. Dwarfs out the so all that stuff about property tax revenue.
Yeah, but you get more butts than seats though.
You know what?
You get more people going to restaurants locally and whatnot, people will be walking distance, you know.
We need, this town, we need grants like 16. Board. Sites that should be considered. It's got ugly looking hill like it's 1960.
Right, ecosystem strategy. You're at the beach, you need to build an economically viable ecotourism solution. We are here at the beach, this is why people come here. We can't make our money off of Taco Bell.
Bonnie, I didn't know if that question you didn't hear raised or even come up in the plan is traffic and exit to exit wherever we're going to build. Is that a consideration that we have to get out of town?
So as Christian presented, we identified that as a concern. Okay. So that we've heard from the community. Okay. But so with that consideration in hand, how do you react to the strategies to build our housing? City has how do you balance those two? Yeah.
Gotta press that.
That's my solution, but it's an oxymoron. I know that's a problem.
I would say let's go ahead and move on to the development. Eliminate the identified strategies. Get something done with the traffic. Moving highways. We kind of skipped around this side. And so number 3, discussion questions should the city eliminate one of the identified questions. Well, that would let you get out fast. Oh, you mean from inside Valley Bar or outside?
I recognize that you were sort of limited in the extent to which we can count employees as a strategy. Limited.
Come into the same conversation for a second.
But I wonder if there's any way that if we were to make a good case, that we were actually going to really try to spur ADUs, right? Is there anything we could put in our housing element that showed a real sort of city emphasis, that sort of showed a commitment, and made it reasonable to assume that we would actually get higher yield on ADUs prospectively, whether we get greater credit than the credit that we're actually sort of assuming. Sort of, I don't know, a marketing campaign, things that we might do to facilitate this through, I don't know, having off-the-shelf plans, you could get approved overnight. Things like that. Yeah, exactly. Well, I don't know. I'm trying to, maybe nothing that extreme. We got community here. Yeah.
I think you bring up a good point. We're ready to get on the ADUs. I hear that, maybe if we make an argument to allow our ADU production to account for more of our potential, that's something that we can work towards. Is there any more objections to ADUs? Strategies?
They're expensive.
There are parking issues?
You're looking like the only city in San Francisco. No time with the sunset.
Parts of Pacific where I live already looks like that.
Yeah, it's just gonna get worse.
Any more thoughts about the ADU strategy?
It doesn't seem like it's highly utilized. I think it's parking.
Well, what do you mean by that?
I think it should have a higher representation on the numbers. An argument for health. Yeah.
John, what's your last name?
That's wrong.
So if we we built the ADU. And then.
You guys built it.
And then.
No, I don't.
If you build ADUs, and then that's counted in on the number of houses you're supposed to build. But then if those are rented, I know
That's also great feedback.
Yeah,
Move on to number 4.
what happens?
So how's it the city?
Our regulations don't allow that.
They don't allow that. So then, when somebody does it, they get busted. They don't get permit to do it.
Code enforcement, well, read them the right.
I don't know, it seems like a really unique solution is enforcement, because they're already in it, and it's already not being used for housing. But
I just was wondering what happens if
yeah,
you
I
build
think
it.
there's gotta be something else not really.
Yeah, I was looking at Airbnb there, because there is a whole process by which you can have Airbnb collect the taxes on behalf of the city, which is something, you know, it doesn't solve the problem in each state, which is where there's a lot of new houses, but it does have to be a comprehensive strategy to fix the housing issues in areas, or the city at least to get the revenues from, you know, and get the tax base so that you have the staff to enforce,
Kevin,
you
if
know.
you rent property in Pacifica, do you guys tax the landowners, like Daily City, Pacifica? If you own property and rent it, are you guys getting a tax benefit from that? No.
Owner of the property, wherever they are, pays property.
No, I'm saying, if I own a property in
There's
Pacifica,
not a business license tax on this.
there is in Daily Cities, there's another, a bunch of cities do have it. Yeah.
So, are you asking about business license tax?
Yes.
If you rent property, yes, you have to pay business license tax. It's like $25.
So you can't you pay a tax on non-residential homes, like if you're not living in a home?
Yeah.
Tax, if you're not living in a primary, if you're not living in it as a primary home, and this kind of gets back to the Airbnb thing, it's like the people who come around, drive around our streets, and like, I need to buy more properties, I only own 6 houses here, and I gotta buy some more, because I got more Airbnbs I need to live in. This is what they say to your face, and there's gotta be a way to prevent that.
Oh my God, so many, it's all very white and short term, but yeah, like, so that's 14%. So like, it's only fair.
What I'm hearing you suggest is tax second homeowners.
I don't know I don't really know the ramifications of it, but it really goes back to how are we going to convert any housing that gets built to reserve it for residential, you know, housing as opposed to, you know, rental, you know, tourism rental, because that's not getting to the housing crisis. Your kids still won't get to live here because the house was purchased by the same person who bought the other 20 houses on your street and was flipping them over. They're not really giving you a rental option or and then in terms of ADUs, though, in terms of like the parking considerations, there should be ways to incentivize you know, use of alternate transportation, so it's not one, you know, everybody in a house has a car, and you know, ways to have increased commuter buses and shuttles to something like that.
What kind of incentives are you imagining for that idea?
I have not gotten that far. I'm just saying that it does, you know, if there is ways that we could come up with at another workshop, how to incentivize alternate transportation. I think many cities, many countries really embrace not a one car per body lifestyle. And I think the one thing we don't have is that we get from here to there. There's limited bus lines, not even safe bike routes. I mean, I can't even literally physically walk from my house to anywhere. Crossing the highways, I'm on like a non-sidewalk.
Anecdotally, house flipping, I feel like, is a way bigger problem Right, it's a bunch of houses that you're right, the one up in Broadway, they get sold, house gets sold around me, most of them one up in Broadway, just get, flipped, prettied up, so it's like there's a bunch of houses for sale that are getting bought up by flippers, speculators, whatever, people aren't actually living in the houses, which means, people are actually trying to buy a house to live in, just keep getting priced out because the flipped houses prices are
Are you saying, are they flipping out to people that are not necessarily living there in the future, or?
I don't know, it's the thing, like the prices are, the prices are so high, it's fine, it almost feels like, it's all techies.
The more houses we provide, hopefully the less of a demand there is to do that, so. I think there's always demand, because we're in the coastal zone, there's only so many houses you can get that have this environment, so that makes us attractive for people who are just gonna come in with all the money, build mega houses, look at what's going on, it's a harmony issue, like, let's put up some
Out for
housing.
10 years.
Right, yeah.
Any more input on ADUs? I'll make a whole bunch of houses on.
How many acres is the Calcit property? So they can do 150 houses?
Right there in the floodplain and on the edge of the mountains, there's no escape when there's a fire.
Relying on it for visual monument.
Yeah, I'm gonna, they wanna move off that.
Are there any specific sites you believe the city should not consider for design housing? Now we've talked about some of them. What about the ones that we shouldn't consider?
Yeah, you were brownfield development.
I did have a question.
Yeah, it's
I
brownfield.
did have a question on the shopping center.
What about
What is there a consideration, again, I don't know if it can be done or not, but was there a consideration of building residential on top of the actual center itself as opposed to just behind it and around it? Because I know in other places I've gone to, they have, shopping centers where it's your grocery store on the bottom, but there's housing, apartment units above the shopping center itself, not just abutting it. And is that something that was considered? I know that there's private ownership and stuff, but like, is that something
What
that?
would you like to see? Would you like the whole site to be utilized?
I think in some cases, in some areas, it would make sense to, there's not blocking any site. Right, at Eureka Square, you've got very big buildings behind it already. It's not necessarily going to be in a view line. There's things that you could do on top as opposed to just around.
The point of a general plan is to talk about what's possible, right? So it's not necessarily what we would like. Guys like Dave would rather let you guys figure out what's possible, and like we just want to remove constraints for the constraints and be more active.
Sequel.
Well, but sequel's not getting, sequel's going to be kinder to building up and building out.
All right, we're not going to get into site specifics. Anything else for commercial? We're still It's that, I don't know that we can assume it, and there's assumptions being that you're like, what were the assumptions? Does he assume that they're talking about things
Why do only 13% of the unit?
It seems like artificially small when you look at the numbers that they're projecting. I'm like, I don't know how it could be that small if you're doing all of that. And if you consider going up one extra level, would that make an incremental difference and start cracking?
13% is about 200.
Some of those centers, some of the Pacifica though, just seems like.
I just have one kind of, I don't know if it's input. If we're looking at commercial sites, that's private property owned by somebody else. If we're saying what we might like, I'm asking the question, we have to get the guy that owns the property there to agree to that. And so are we going to financially?
If I can answer that. So what we're talking about is creating regulations to allow that type of development. That's going to be a property owner's decision to make whether they want to pursue.
So it just allows them.
Envisioning what we do.
Doesn't mean it's going to happen. Right. Because the developer who's already put new facade on Eureka Square is not going to want to tear that off and put a part of the building somewhere. It's too expensive.
Unless maybe the regulations are so easy to allow them to do that, they might want to do that. So
They get something back.
Specifically, like a land update or like a housing element update cannot be made in that takes into account the property owner. Like the whole point of a general land update is to talk about what the community needs. And then when we go to like individual developments, then it's more,
Can't make it biased to a single property owner.
Public property sites, move on to that conversation. What about this idea?
Yes. Well, question one's the most important question. Those are the core issues, right? Are these strategies the right strategies?
Tony's doing a really good job.
It's herding ducks, and it's a big group.
A lot of snakes
Good,
here.
great. I wonder where.
Okay, so in the public properties, how are we feeling about that? Reactions, thoughts?
Good strategy.
Good?
Can you remind me of the public property sites? Oh, that was separate from Calvin.
These are like city properties, maybe school properties.
And also, that's where you prioritize affordable housing, right? That's already close to transit.
It's a good opportunity for work. You know, obviously, you've got the Pacifica District doing workforce stuff. So, I mean, it's a good opportunity.
I guess I'm assuming, I hope correctly, that when we think about Oceana High School and other public property sites like that we're not taking soccer fields and things that are used for the community for general community activities. That, I mean, some of the soccer sites, some of the sites at Oceana definitely for housing, but you don't want to take baseball fields.
That's an important consideration.
Yeah, so I guess I'm gonna broaden that out maybe and say the recreational, considerations of development should be made of being able to our recreational facilities.
I would assume it would be.
I think parks and recreational areas should be at least considered parks and properties. That would be my opinion. I don't want to take something away that's.
So in other words,
Somebody's
Build in and around it so it enhances it, and how wonderful to be able to have that space for.
What are we going to do in the future? When I grew up here, there were twice the number of schools.
Yeah.
Right, guys?
We're turning over.
Yeah.
People used to hitchhike up and down Living Road.
Yeah.
That's where I started.
What used to be the Lindmore School, was that site, is that considered? Is it the Harvard?
It's Spectrum. It's a developmental disabled program.
I think they still, yeah, so is that, was that, I don't know if that was considered a public site, it's like, that's like a big space over there, and I did not see or hear anything about that.
Okay, any other topics about
public property.
Like, at a great point for affordable house, like to emphasize affordable housing.
And especially if you're talking about like housing for teachers, like,
Yeah.
it's a really good place to put it.
Yeah, but I think what happens if, like John was saying, you start getting a higher concentration of kids coming through, like the 70s, right? Once you get rid of that school, you're not getting that.
Build the first school. That is second story.
Or just densify the schools. I mean, the schools, it's not like the campus is going away. I mean, some have gone.
Angel Valley, Crespi.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now we're talking Lindemark School.
Yeah. I think there's rather that would be handled through redevelopment of the schools and really lots of stuff. But I hear, all of it goes back to infrastructure, right? If you put all these people in there, what are you going to do with all the other stuff? It all is going to tie in. But we're just here to give a feedback. All right, next one is Caltrans properties. Yeah, I didn't hear the list. One right here. And which one? Like, that's a Caltrans property. I think that was under, that little
They may be renting it.
Safeway shopping center. Down here in Linamar. Right. You know, there's a park, the park right There's a little park behind it.
Sam Trans.
You sure it's Sam Trans? I thought that the
Caltrans
little
on
building
Highway
was.
1. Caltrans has Highway 1 next to the community center.
I think it's still a lot in our location that we're.
Oh, we know you can.
Okay. We can tell, yeah. I mean, that also. It's no bad idea, because we're all talking. It seems like a no-brainer. So Caltrans properties, any other ones? Thoughts? We like the idea of building out excess runway? Okay. We can't take their property. Again, we can encourage development. You can make it available for development, should development.
I'm just wondering whether HCV is going to be like, it needs to be feasible, you know, whatever term. Like, we're excited, just consistent.
I just want to be, know all these other Caltrans areas, I know. And so I'm really concerned that if it's Caltrans property, that now it's going to be housing. How is that going to, are we going to consider that an impact on traffic? Because there is that property, there's already the developer looking at taking that right away on 601. And so that's a big impact on traffic flow, safety. So that's a consideration in these Caltrans. Could be a consideration.
Do you also question a little bit, going back to like where we're thinking within the box for these things that were presented, like a lot of things in the initial, like key assumptions. My question, why is that an assumption? Like, there's a bunch of stuff that like we're not going to consider these because they're already this or that. I'm just questioning. It just seems like there's a lot of areas in Pacifica that we're not talking about that seem like they would support more residential development, but we've taken them off the table already. I want to hear about those ideas and what areas we're talking about specifically. I want to get through the rest of the questions first and definitely get everybody's impact, but we'll put a pin on that, but we're going to come back to that. Jay, I haven't heard from you. Are you?
What I'm not hearing is I hear encourage development via code reduction. What I'm not hearing about is eminent domain. Is there any plan for eminent domain?
So again, would it be the city building the house? No, it's the city building the regulatory infrastructure to allow houses to be developed by the
There was 2,000 square feet.
Sounds good. Sounds good. I just have that in the back of my mind always about cities reaching. But code, reducing the code may be a good thing. I agree with Joanne about identifying current substance limitations. Why are they? Why are there set aside? I agree with that.
We're gonna come back. Well, I'm doing my best. You're doing good. The last one is.
Question, Bonnie? What about people that are turning their homes into boarding houses? Is that considered like an accessory dwelling use of primary property?
When you say boarding house, can you be more specific than what you mean?
Somebody who's carving up a single family home so that it can accommodate, I don't know, 5 families and all of their cars. And they're doing so illegally, and I think that they're doing that with knowledge from the police department, with knowledge from code enforcement. And when I hear about Airbnb use, the code enforcement being there, I laugh because code enforcement demands documentation, go down there, give me your name, give me your address, give me all of this information, and then I see very little being done. Does that mean that code enforcement is going to have a windfall of money to do this kind of enforcement with whatever might be coming?
So I think that's maybe the other direction of this conversation. We're looking to create more housing. It sounds like you're struggling with some issues broken up and utilizing it more than that easily.
Right, I'm just wondering if they're considered accessory dwelling. You noted they may be if there's one. I get that.
There are reasons, so there's a lot of that going on, but I think undervaluing how much housing is being chopped up. If that would reduce our headcount, maybe is that something that you're supportive of?
I think that it's discouraging that single family homes are being used that way. It's discouraging that neighborhoods are being used in that way without any qualification. And it is also discouraging that they aren't being counted. If we're counting everything, maybe we should count it does undervalue parking, and everybody is struggling with parking spot. Just one in front of your house, just one. That would be great.
Alright, I'm gonna move us on to coastal zones. Any feedback, thoughts, discussion points, coastal zones? No development.
All you're gonna do is having all
Can we get feedback?
any housing that you're gonna put in.
You can take one of these.
Houses in danger.
Okay. Any other thoughts about coastal zone development?
Well, if it's developed, if that's still on, that's where I see cities like La Jolla and other parts of our great coastline doing extraordinarily well. If that was to be considered. If there was other projects that were put into play. And if it's a commercial issue, if it's about putting in another leg of land on the side, I don't know if that's something that's possible. But I'm just thinking that if that's something to solve, because money was something that should not be off the table. It is a house.
I do want to, I do think developing the business is super challenging, and I don't, but I would note that we're assuming 11% of our units could be met from the coastal zone. That's 200 something units. So if we're not going to do that, we really have to be prepared to identify some other things in some other places and come up with some other strategies in order to make that. Because to take that off the table is a big deal.
That's what the whole last hour and a half was about, right?
I think realistically, I think we need to leave it in the mix. But if we're going to take it out, then we have to be prepared to do some heavy lifting other places.
But I think it's, and whenever we propose needs to be feasible and we consider the regulatory framework that the state has proposed, right? Like you can't try to satisfy a state regulatory, housing framework by ignoring the coastal commission's framework. Like we're not going to succeed as a city if we try to divide one lot and I think that's the question, the concern it's not feasible and it's not realistic to assume 20%, 26% growth or 26% of our real number in an area that is so challenging.
So it's 11% of our
That take those away challenge.
It's only 11%.
Okay, 11%. That's still.
Any other thoughts?
We make like a 2 minute break.
Any more closing thoughts or questions?
I don't know.
Has always been curious to me because how do you build a low house around here when the land values are
Unfortunately, I know,
Affordable.
I think a lot of those
Remember that shift.
So here's my thought. In San Francisco, there's an area called tiny house. And I don't know how they did it. I don't know the mechanics of it, but there's probably 500 condominiums that you can buy, and it's only allowed to appreciate 5%. So when you sell it, that's all you can take with you. The next product is to buy it back. So that would facilitate some ownership of low
Shared equity.
So
What you're explaining is
yes. And so I'm just saying, I think the city county of San Francisco is redeveloped. San Mateo County and so
so they probably do, and we can create our regulations to allow the amount of density that the developer will need to allow that type of.
Probably strategize with each other in this section.
So, the answer to your question, how do we balance the high cost of affordable housing density and get as much out of that? I think it would just be incredibly reckless of the city to endorse building in coastal zones where you're already having houses falling in the cliff and you've got issues of management tree and how you're going to protect all the people who are already built there and then just forget all this happens and then do it some more. It is just reckless. Any other coastal zone feedback or thoughts?
I just have one thing. So if there is any place in Pacifica in which it looks like in the coastal zone could be built, it seems like then there's always a lot of litigation that comes up with that, and that no matter what happens, we'll come up with that again. So I hear what you're saying about the 11%, where can we put it? But if we're going to be having a ton of money to fight it, because people are going to want it, better just to say, let's cut it out and find some because it is such a difficult issue.
Things do get built in coastal zone. I mean, it's not, bottom line is that, there are a lot of constraints, and it's not impossible. I think we need to identify places that are feasible. But I hear what you're saying.
You end up having to build a seawall and build it higher and build it higher. It just doesn't behoove anybody because the people and the houses in danger and then have to just be paying and paying to protect them from the obvious sea level rise and all the environmental and they fall off.
Talk about the coastal zone, we have to be mindful of the city has very hard. So it has to be a real mindful approach. I don't know what that is. said means, but I do think what goes around comes around. Not ruling it out, but using some kind of brain approach. But I don't know what that means. We spend a lot of money in the city for that.
Information connect cannot depend on who's tomorrow. I mean, that's already like all over, all the documentation that's around. So that's why I'm just concerned.
We're good with postal, is there more on postal zone? Okay, I think a good way to pose this out is I've heard feedback is that why are we being boxed into these six strategies? Why don't we look at other strategies? What other strategies? We're here to hear input on if you have other thoughts about looking at other sites that have value. This would be a great time to provide that feedback. It was reversed. I wanted to know what sites got taken off the table that we weren't looking at. I don't have that information in front of me. I'd like to know what was already being taken off to come to this presentation, why. It goes back to like, what were the assumptions? Because we were just told, these are our assumptions, not how we discussed those assumptions. And just like the
All right. Do you know where the
I can go.
not for you, I guess.
yeah, we hear you.
Why don't you?
I don't know. I think it's fine.
Maybe I'm talking too much.
Yeah.
All right, let me try this again. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Is it? Yeah, learning how to use a microphone, step one of the housing element process. All right, everybody, let's go ahead and wrap it up.
Analyst for planning department, city manager's office.
You're gonna float, right? So I'll just use the microphone and not use.
I got it. Okay, where are we going? I will share.
All right, hopefully you can hear me now on this microphone. We're going to wrap up the small group discussions. We are going to go from group to group, and we are going to ask your facilitators to summarize the input and feedback that you've all provided. Hopefully we will hear some different ideas and maybe some different insights, new concepts and such that the city can consider. And also if you've discussed something that a prior group has said, you can just briefly summarize that so that we can efficiently work throughout the entire room. So Elizabeth, why don't you get us started with the first group?
Sure. Mr. Nick, would you be willing to share on your table's behalf?
Thank you. Well, we had a vibrant conversation at our tables, and we decided that we wanted to move the tables together to give a little modicum of social distancing. So listen, we were feeling passionate about some of these questions. We did an exercise at some point where we were having trouble talking about what we liked the most, but we all knew what we didn't like. So we went around and we said, well, what did we dislike the most? And then we could invert that to figure out kind of, given the options, what would we prefer? So here's where we landed. There was relatively much more support, a lot of support for ADUs, the shopping centers, the public property sites, and the Caltrans sites. We were pretty evenly divided on the question of the general plan sites. There's still some concerns from that process that are evident here today that aren't yet fully resolved among the people. And there was a general consensus that the coastal zones are something to be dealt with very carefully, and not a lot of interest in seeing development in the coastal zones. In addition, sorry. There's some a lot of concerns about infrastructure And there were a few other suggestions that were brought up that I wanted to highlight. Financing for ADUs and bridging the gap between a current homeowner that may be desiring to make more money off their property by dividing it or having an ADU or a rental there, but not being able to have the capital to make that happen so that they could benefit from that revenue in the future. And could there be some programs to support people in that position? It was also raised at our table that while interest rates in the market had been low for a very long time, that's changing. And so support for low interest rate programs to support that kind of activity to produce housing was something that was raised as well. And then finally, we talked about some sites, and I can transmit the sites, separately. But there was an acknowledgement that there are specifically a lot of the public sites. There's the Sanchez Art Center behind the fire station that were raised as kind of not living up to their full potential. And then finally, there was this, I think, a general sentiment that people feel that we need housing in Pacifica, but the harder piece is where. But we do need it. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Nick. Thank you, everybody at this table. Next table, please.
Hello. So our group discussed all the sites. There was no real pushback on any individual site, excluding mainly the Oceana site, mainly regarding the upper parking lot, as well as just the volume of housing going along the road going up, past, what would that be? Paloma, yeah. And just having 300 units in that one location on that one street is a little high of a density. But as far as any pushback on any of the proposed sites, most of it was more, some of these locations could be even more on more than 30 units per acre, especially the ones located near the commercial sites, like the Linamar General Plan, as well as potentially even other locations like Eureka Square, Fairmont, or any other commercial, shopping center. Can you think of any other strategy we would consider? Mostly, we did propose a lot more locations, and we'll send that over. But should the city eliminate any of these identified strategies? The answer from our group was pretty much no, except for the Oceana limitations on that location. And that's all we have.
That's great. Thanks, Mario, and thank you to everybody at that table. As we're transitioning, one common question that came up is, are these the only sites, those that were in the presentation in your handouts? No, they're not. Those were example sites to show application of that particular site strategy. There are numerous other sites associated with each of those strategies that reach that total percentage of units that we showed on each of those example strategies. So the specific sites, will be released as part of a future draft for the housing element. We will develop that site list once we confirm and feel strongly about the particular strategies that the community will be able to support.
Hello, folks. Anthony Shriver. I'm with the Parks, Beaches, and Recreation Department. So we had some really great discussion here this evening. And number one is, what is your reaction to identified strategies? We had some good discussion about privately owned lots as well, and why aren't those being considered? Other locations were the quarry, as y'all know, by Rockaway. Some of the locations that were discussed were the Eureka Square as well, and the Manor shopping area space, such as also we mentioned Fairmont, the Linamar School, the Sanchez Fields as well too. Some other areas that were brought up were the ranches as well, and how they have a lot of land too, and so why aren't those ones being considered? For number 2, can you think of any other strategies that should be considered? And the highlighted one was the privately owned land and really considering the triplexes and quadplexes too. And let's see, moving on to number 3, we didn't have any more much feedback of should the city eliminate any of the identified strategies. We said none. And then moving on to number 4, and that question was, how should the city close the remaining gap? And we identified some of the churches as well, such as the Lutheran Church or the one on Pacific Manor as well too. And so that was some really good discussion around the churches. And then number 5, are there any specific sites you believe the city should not consider? And we were talking about the parking spaces and how we could maximize those but not have a negative impact on them too. Another area that was identified was the Seabowl too, that Seabowl parking lot in that area. And the main thing that was identified was to save our open space and save our hillsides, was mentioned too. So that was a lot of the discussion that we had at our table this evening.
That's great. Thank you, Anthony, and all of the participants at that table.
My pleasure.
Didn't know we were introducing ourselves. So I'm Mike Perez. I'm the Parks, Beach, and Recreation Director. That's Anthony's my staff there. Thank you, Anthony. They were looking at our paper, I think, because some of the things we had, they said too. Reaction, yeah, exactly. We'll take it outside later. Reaction to our identified strategies. First thing that came out was pleasantly surprised and enjoyed or liked that the shopping centers were included for affordable housing, that the hillsides were being looked after and not included, no focus on the hillsides, and public properties on target there, and wondering just what Christian was mentioning about these were examples, and so folks were very interested to know what the other examples would be. So for instance, the public properties, what other public properties, and in particular someone had asked about like the library site. And also happy that the Lindemar Woods was not in there, that area, or the Pedro Point section there. So very happy that that wasn't in there. Wondering why the quarry was not. Christian came over and talked to us about that. And we thought that, what about traffic and safety and those types of concerns that were not discussed, or they should be discussed actually, in terms of other strategies. And then we also said, what about churches? You know, there's some churches have a lot of space on there, and someone mentioned there's some spots, or there's land by St. Peter's, but also mentioning that Good Shepherd has the senior housing there, so that's kind of nice there that we have that. And then north side of Fassler, does that count? And I think in general, if there's a project in the pipeline, folks want to know, does that count? Is that part of what we're talking about, or no, those are not included? And as far as anything that we should eliminate, I don't know that we want to eliminate, but definitely just the two words coastal zone together sort of elicited a reaction in general from the group, and are kind of concerned about that. It's something, do we want that in there or not? And then, oh, sorry, I broke my page for no reason. So, and it was definitely, in terms of the increase per acre, was a definite no from this group. They're like, yeah, and I think it would be good maybe for folks to see an example. What does 30 units on an acre look like? So trying to sort of visualize that. I don't know if we have anything in town that we could compare that to, or some way that you could see it and kind of get an idea like, well, how many stories is that? How much space does that take up? But I don't think anyone was comfortable going more than the 30 units per acre. And then number 5, which was any specific sites you believe the city should not consider. And again, we repeated, not on the hillside. So, and again, grateful that was, people were hearing that from the community and stuff. And then some of the things that we thought should be included in terms of the values on the last statement. The last question was maintaining the environment should be included. And we said no paving on Paradise, okay? We don't want to pave over any natural areas. Climate change effects need to be considered. And we also, again, I had mentioned earlier, safety. We talked a little bit about safety, access, fire support, evacuation plans, and things like that. How does that all come into the planning? And that's it for us.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Mike, and everyone at that table. Appreciate it.
We won, right? No, just kidding.
Okay, we had a lot of conversations about constraints and the assumptions of our constraints, especially when it came to the impact that the development of our general plan sites and our commercial sites could have on our arena. So if there are, what I heard from my group was if there's the ability to push the constraints that we can make on these developments in terms of maybe allowing more density, more height, to allow more of that infill. There was support for that. There was also the question about the quarry, why it wasn't included. On the topic of public property, there was some additional areas that were identified as potential candidates to be developed, and also identifying that these are the areas that would probably be most supportive of affordable housing and workforce housing. There was a discussion about the effect of Airbnbs on our housing and how we were going to balance those impacts. In terms of ADUs, there was support for those, and any way that we could in our housing element allow for more reliance on ADUs was encouraged. Let's see. In general, just the support of infill development, support of brownfield development, encouraging our commercial sites to be fully developed, not only units above the existing development, but even using some of the parking space for more development. Let's see. In terms of the public property areas, especially regarding our schools, recognizing that housing development shouldn't negatively impact the recreational facilities that those spaces provide to our community, and that there should be a balance of housing needs for our current housing needs and potential school land needs in the future. With that additional development, the question was, where are those kids going to go to school when the schools fill up? Just touching on Caltrans, there was general support for that, but wanting to recognize that development of Caltrans properties may impact traffic. And coastal zone, it was mixed feedback. I heard no development, period, and I heard we need to keep it in there as a tool to get to our goal. So there's definitely some challenges and concerns with coastal zone development from both camps. And that's it.
Great. Thanks so much, Bonnie, and everybody that was in that group.
I'll report from back here, but my group was right here in the middle, table 5, S1. There were right away reactions from this group were really not to remove any of the sites that we saw in there, but we want to hear more. We want to hear more about coastal zone development. We need more information from what's happening there, and we need more information about hazard zones. Right away, we jumped into a discussion about kind of what Bonnie said with her group. Is it cutting in and out, or is that just me? Sorry. right away we heard more density, build higher, build more, build more, build higher. Where it's already been built, let's build it up higher, let's build it out more. And so there was a lot of support regarding that from our group, particularly with the shopping center areas, the general plan sites, and the Caltrans site was mentioned. The public property sites were mentioned would be the most ideal spot to incentivize affordable housing or to do affordable housing, because the city would have more control over their areas. Because of the way the highway is, our group talked about keeping increased density north of the Manor Parkway. Did I get that right? The Manor Shopping? Yes, to keep it north of there, because there's already highway built for it there. It wouldn't increase traffic. They also appreciated that hillsides were protected in the proposed strategies, the proposed sites. Added sites that I will contribute later: Park Mall, Lindemar Shopping, Fairmont Manor Safeway, etc. Really, the tone from the group was, where can we push the boundaries of what Pacificans might accept? And seemed to really focus on that being where there's already built, where it wouldn't affect views, it wouldn't affect traffic more. So like I said, shopping centers and the like. There was a lot of talk of needing to partner with our agencies to see how we could think of policies, strategies to incentivize these sort of developments. We need to be talking to Caltrans. We need to be talking to the MTC. We need to be talking to those partners who are going to have a part in attracting developers to come to these places to build out. There were more, and I'm sorry if it's escaping me to capture more of what we said. I did take notes, but that would conclude my report out from our group.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and the group in the middle of the room. So, our next steps. First off, I want to thank everybody so very much from the bottom of my heart for taking the time tonight, sticking it out to the end as you've all done that are here. I found the discussions I observed and the questions I answered and the dialogue that I had with many of you very rewarding and very informative. We are going to take note of all of this feedback, as I mentioned, combine it with feedback received from our next week's community meeting on Tuesday, November 1st at 6 p.m. at Sunset Ridge. We're going to do this all over again. Same content, same program, different neighbors. So all of you are welcome to attend. Come here from different folks, maybe folks from a different part of town, a different walk of life, whatever the case, different mix of people, perhaps different outcomes. So consider attending, and if you don't want to, help spread the word. We need a lot of people from our community in these meetings to share their insights. And so after we conclude the 2 community meetings, we're going to distill that information, combine it with work we're doing on the rest of the housing element, including that work on our policies and programs that I mentioned, all of which we are going to piece together into preparing a draft document with the goal of releasing it early in 2023 for a public comment period, at which time we are going to welcome a lot more community input from you in terms of your comments on that document. And so before you go, we want to provide you an opportunity to share any additional thoughts that occur to you after you leave. Email us at housing@pacifica.gov. You can go to our website, planpacifica.org, go to the projects and housing elements section of the site to stay informed with developments in our process, new public input opportunities, key information about progression in the process, so on and so on. And lastly, I want to make sure you all know to sign up for our mailing list that we are maintaining for the Housing Element Update. You can text Pacifica Housing to 22828, or I'll leave it on the screen up here and on the projector over there on your way out. You can hold your smartphone up to the QR code and it will take you right to that website. So with that, thank you again. Take some food to go if you want. Please make sure you fill out and leave the surveys on your tables. And I don't know if anyone located their keys. If you're missing a set of keys, come see me before you go. The person stranded in the parking lot. Thank you so much, everybody. We'll see you soon.